Jan Blachowicz, the Prince of Szczecin, legendary Polish power, Viscount of the Vistula, King of Kielbasa, the Paladin of Pierogi. Former UFC Light Heavyweight Champion Jan Blachowicz is arguably the most underrated striker in modern mixed martial arts. His style defies many of the visual expectations of your average MMA fan, lacking the smooth, slick footwork of an Israel Adesanya, the precise accuracy of an Anderson Silva, or the airy one-shot power of an Alex Pereira. But make no mistake, the Polish veteran is one of the craftiest kickboxers to ever grace the heavier weight classes of the sport, often overlooked due to his relatively advanced age or his record of 29-10-1, which includes a lackluster early UFC run from his sophomore outing in April 2015 until October 2017 when he went 1-4. Blachowicz's story is not one of preternatural talent or irresistible physical potency, but of growth in fits and starts. He embodies the dialectical nature of a martial artist's development, retaining what works, abandoning what doesn't, and adding new approaches to maximize his potential. I'm Josh from Dialectic of Violence, and welcome to this channel's 5th episode, Jan Blachowicz, Slav Junk Striking Savant. So some of the less basement-dwelling amongst you may be wondering, what is Slav Jank? Is some kind of traditional Eastern European martial art dating back to the mysterious migration era of the Dark Age Slavic tribes? Is it some syncretic martial art based on the ancient secrets of Himalayan monks passed on to Soviet artist and traveler Nicholas Rurik? Maybe it's a set of moves mastered by the mad mystic Nikolai Rasputin to enrapture the wife of Russia's last Tsar. No, it's a genre of post-Soviet Eastern European video games, notable for being charming but awkward, and lacking in the smoothness of play that more modern mainstream games have built into their core design. In many ways, I feel like this is a valid way to describe Jan Blachowicz's striking style. Whilst obviously incorporating elements of both European and Thai-style kickboxing, it doesn't quite resemble the widely accepted best practice of either. Instead, it's patched together to compensate for Jan's athletic shortcomings and exacerbate his innate athletic advantages in certain areas. So, what are these physical advantages and disadvantages? Well, unsurprisingly from someone that promotes himself on his legendary Polish power, Jan Blachowicz is heavy-handed. Noticeably, he actually possesses knockout power in both his left and his right hand. His power is not just limited to his punches, however. His kicks, particularly his lead left body kick, are very potent weapons. He has surprising dexterity with strikes originating from the left side of his body, whether punches or kicks. He's also very durable, with his only knockout loss in the UFC coming against Thiago Marreta Santos on a shot that he ran face first into, and even then he was dropped, but he wasn't fully put out. It was one of those knockdown, couple hammer fist, ref pulls him off kind of deals. Where Jan is less physically gifted is in his speed, particularly the speed of his feet. His hand's about average in terms of speed, and he tends to sit in his stance quite heavily on his feet, except when evading low kicks. And as such, he relies on good shot selection and timing to compensate for the speed disadvantage he has against many other top light heavyweights. Blachowicz also tends to struggle a little bit with his cardio, often falling off in terms of output in the third round. And although he's gone 5 full rounds before on several occasions, his pace does drop noticeably in the championship rounds. Jan Blachowicz predominantly fights as a counter-striker, but is willing to adapt his approach to deal with specific opponents and their distinct combat methodologies. He's also able to do so due to a diverse striking toolkit paired with a number of unorthodox and advanced tricks he's built into his style over time. In this video, I'll be examining Jan's favoured weapons, when he uses them, as well as what I deem meta-technical, I'm doing air quotes with my fingers, elements that help to elevate Jan's style far beyond the other slow-footed, heavy-handed fighters that are a dime a dozen in MMA above 185 pounds. Perhaps the most well-known element of Jan Blachowicz's striking is his diverse and damaging range of leg kicks. Despite the effectiveness of Blachowicz's low kicks being attributed to mammoth bones by Joe Rogan, in fact, Blachowicz uses deliberate and systematic breakdowns of his opponent's front legs regardless of their stance. A key part of what makes Jan's use of low kicks as an attritional weapon so effective is the diversity of his low kicks. Not only will he alternate between inside and outside low kicks, favouring one or the other depending on the stance and style of his opponents, he'll also target multiple areas of the leg. Aside from attacking the calf and the thigh, he's also particularly fond of inside low kicks targeted just below the back of the knee, no doubt causing significant damage to the ligaments that hold together the knee joint. Not content with simply kicking his opponents' legs out from under them, Blachowicz employs a number of countermeasures to neuter the offensive low-kicking games of his opponents. Whilst he employs conventional hinge checks that are purely defensive in nature, he'll also on occasion meet the incoming leg with his own, intercepting and relying on his bone density to do more damage to the opponent than he takes, and making his opponents wary of potentially breaking their shins on his. At medium range, Jan is a relatively active jabber by MMA standards. He'll utilize the jab moving backwards as a means to blunt his opponent's initiative and interrupt their forward movement, while also using it to push opponents back towards the fence. Whilst many MMA fighters only utilize the jab as a single punch towards the head, Blachowicz has shown a tendency to double up the jab, which has a number of benefits, including punishing opponents who rely merely on head movement to avoid jabs. He'll also jab to the body to drive opponents back or to bring their attention down, to then follow up with combinations that target the head. When a long but arcing punch is needed, Jan enthusiastically employs a long left hook, both as a counter and used offensively. In order to make up distance and compensate for his relatively slow feet, Blachowicz often utilizes what I call the Fraser step, which I'll explore in more detail a little later in the video. Whilst the left hook and the jab are Jan Blachowicz's favoured punches, he'll also utilize a wider diversity of punches such as uppercuts, the right hook, straights with both the right and the left hands, but where Blachowicz's punching game really stands out is the modularity of the punching combinations, another element which I'll give more specific time to shortly. Another one of Jan Blachowicz's favoured offensive weapons is his left body kick. This kick is used almost exclusively to build up attritional damage against opponents as they exit the pocket. Jan's dexterity and accuracy with this particular strike allows him to consistently land on the right side of his opponent's body, often slotting in under the elbow. Jan Blachowicz shines in punishing opponents' interstitial movements, that is, whilst they attempt to progress through different ranges. Mixed martial arts can be conceptualized as occurring between three distinct stages or ranges. Long range, generally thought of as kicking range, the mid-range or punching range, and close range, which is when you make close contact, so clinches or wrestling. In order to enter into mid and close range, the opponent must traverse the long range engagement zone, and so on, for the different ranges. Given that no matter how good the form of the opponent, commencement of an attack will leave some vulnerabilities, Jan uses various striking techniques to punish interstitial movement. This is not especially unique in and of itself to Blachowicz, after all it's the modus operandi of all counter-strikers, but where Blachowicz sets himself apart from the pack is that he exploits opening and interstitial movements in all directions. Not only does he punish you for coming closer like a typical counter-striker would, but he also takes advantage of MMA fighters' tendency to use distance as their primary mode of defense to catch them exiting the clinch or the pocket. Lacking the physical capacity to shock his opponents with sudden bursts of speed, Blachowicz uses both awkward timing and rhythm to keep his opponents uncomfortable. One of the most noticeable methods he utilizes to mess with his opponents, particularly southpaws, is what I'm going to refer to as inverted combinations. It's worth explaining what I mean by this. The majority of basic punching combinations utilize the lead hand first, followed by the power hand. This isn't for no reason. By making contact with the lead hand, the range is established for the power hand, and if the lead hand lands, it often masks the approach of the rear hand, limiting the ability for an unprepared opponent to respond. But of course, the whole sport of MMA isn't just people throwing 1-2s at each other. Diversity is key to limiting the opponent's ability to counter. With regards to southpaws, they typically get very accustomed to countering the basic combinations typical of orthodox fighters, such as a 1-2. Blachowicz will often lead with a right hand against southpaws, which isn't itself uncommon and is actually widely considered the best way to deal with southpaws, but he will then follow up with a left, and then often with more punches behind it. This inverts the usual left punch, left punch rhythm, as they're replacing it with a right, left, right pattern that's less intuitive to deal with for southpaws, because it is the inverse of what they're used to dealing with in sparring. The Fraser step further complicates Jan Blachowicz's opponents' attempts to gauge his distance, both in the pocket and in medium range. I refer to it as a Fraser step because it's similar in principle to the step that legendary boxer Smokin' Joe Frazier would use to generate massive power and surprising reach on his left hook. Whereas fighters will generally, when moving forward, widen their stance by stepping forward with their lead foot and then bringing their rear foot along behind it to reset their stance, the Fraser step is instead when the rear foot moves forward, having the feet very close together momentarily before the front foot then springs forward itself. There are negatives to this footwork technique, but one of its positives is that it allows the rear foot to act as a sudden spring, allowing a forward burst. When coupled with long weapons, such as the left hook or in MMA the left body kick, it allows the attack to travel deceptively far, often catching opponents unaware where they think that they've put enough distance to avoid oncoming strikes. Additionally, while it does tend to limit the potency of strikes coming from the right side of the practitioner, in the case of Blachowicz, it can be paired with a sudden clockwise rotation of the left hip to accentuate power coming from the left hand in the orthodox fighter. Blachowicz often uses a Fraser step and a long left hook or body kick when he decides to drive his opponents backwards. Yet another, and this time a bit more infamous tendency of Jan Blachowicz's is the often maligned bursts of sudden offense that have been dubbed by the MMA analysis community the Blacho Blitz. An otherwise sober and principled kickboxer, on occasion Jan will suddenly run forward somewhat awkwardly, throwing multiple punch combinations with both hands. Whilst easy to criticise because it appears to leave him out of position and he often has his chin up in the air while doing so, it is worth noting that Blachowicz has only experienced severe consequences for the Blitz basically once against Thiago Santos. In fact, the Blacho Blitz has actually been a very effective weapon for Jan against multiple opponents, including such dangerous and accurate counterpunches as Alex Pereira. So why does the Blacho Blitz even work? Why do the light heavyweights not just chin him as he flails wildly at him? In my opinion, it's a result of the Blacho Blitz actually being a modular combination. I can practically already hear the groans. Oh, great, Josh. Now you're just coming up with more terms. Yeah, well, good luck finding another Jan Blachowicz striking study with this much depth. What I mean by modular striking is that there's no clearly apparent pattern to what strikes are thrown in the Blacho Blitz and in what order. Sure, it might start with a left, then a right, then a left, but where that first left is a hook, an uppercut, a straight, that changes, and so too for the following shots. Blachowicz's are like snowflakes, none are identical, and as such they're incredibly hard to counter, especially for single layer counter strikers that rely on maintaining the perfect distance for their preferred techniques. Guys such as Dominic Reyes, and to an extent, Alex Pereira. The Blacho Blitz may not have the grace, elegance, or the perfect efficiency of, combinations that are drilled a million times, but it is a useful part of Jan's striking arsenal nonetheless. With the possible exception of the Blacho Blitzes, Jan actually improvises very little in the cage. For each opponent, Jan and his team set out tailored game plans designed to nullify his opponents. Of course, Jan isn't an undefeated fighter, so these aren't always 100% successful for various reasons, but it's worth looking over many of the notable, unique manners that Blachowicz engaged his UFC opponents with over the years. So in this next section, I'm just going to briefly go through different fights that he had in the UFC and a quick overview of the kind of approaches that he took. In his UFC debut against Kosovar Swede Ilir Latifi in October 2014, Blachowicz took an uncharacteristically aggressive approach, pushing Latifi back against the fence with punching combinations, encouraging him to exit out the side, and circling him into a hard body kick that badly hurt Latifi, who then thereafter ducked into a head kick and was finished. By pushing Latifi back, not only was Blachowicz corralling Latifi into the body kick, that's one of his best weapons, but he also made it more difficult for the muscular wrestle boxer to shoot on him. It's much harder for more conventional wrestlers to hit takedowns going backwards than it is going forward. So Jan Blachowicz basically tried to nullify that approach and fortunately was able to get an early finish. After 2 consecutive decision losses in his next couple fights against Jimmy Manuwa and Corey Anderson, Blachowicz would salvage his UFC career in April 2016 by defeating local fighter Igor Pokrajac in Zagreb, Croatia. Looking to get an emphatic knockout in front of his countrymen, Pokrajac repeatedly mounted linear charges at Blachowicz behind volleys of punches. Blachowicz played the matador to the Croatian bull and utilized body kicks and left hooks after angling off to punish Pokrajac for his reckless assaults. As the fight went on and Pokrajac's forward charges became less frequent, Blachowicz took over the fight, taking the Croat down in the second half of the third and securing a 29-28 victory on all 3 judges' scorecards. In September of the same year, Blachowicz would be faced with an enormous step up, facing an Alexander Gustafsson fresh off his split decision loss against Daniel Cormier in his second attempt at UFC Gold. Despite coming into the fight a 5-1 underdog, Blachowicz made Gustafsson very uncomfortable on the feet, attacking Gus's body, using overhand right counters to attack over the Swede's left hooks, and jabbing with his rangy adversary. Blachowicz proved dangerous in the interstitial stages of the fight, including on clinch breaks. As he employed against Gustafsson's teammate in his UFC debut, Blachowicz also took advantage of Gustafsson's pronounced circling habit to deliver body kicks and jabs at range. Blachowicz's varied attacks had a lot of success, notably at the beginning of round 2, when using 2 consecutive double jab approaches to then condition Gus into expecting a straight jab but throwing a long lead uppercut and a right hook to circumvent the Swede's guard. In the end, Gustafsson's experience and fight IQ would salvage what could have been a humiliating outing against a perceived journeyman. By taking Blachowicz down and delivering ground and pound over long stretches of the fight, Gustafsson would end up taking the fight 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards. After a close majority decision loss to Patrick Cummings in his next outing, Blachowicz would take on the athletic Devin Clark in October 2017. Although with less outright intensity than Prowess had shown a year prior, Clark also attempted to bully Blachowicz with linear rushes. Blachowicz effectively played the matador once again, punishing Clark's entries with low kicks, left hooks and body kicks. In the second round, Blachowicz would seize the forward initiative, driving Clark back to the cage, hitting him with a body kick while Clark retreated, and eventually securing a submission win against the cage. Unbeknownst to all, this would prove to actually be the start of Blachowicz's run to the light heavyweight title. Staying active and maintaining momentum, Blachowicz fought less than 2 months later against the then light heavyweight Jared Cannonier. Cannonier, a methodical marauder with knockout power in both hands, required a different type of counter-striking approach that had been used to stymie Prowess and Clark during their linear rushes. Aware that Cannonier was dangerous from both sides, Blachowicz limited his time spent directly in front of the killer gorilla, angling off and drawing Cannonier onto low kicks, body kicks, jabs, and left hooks. This limited the potential weapons that Cannonier could use. As long as Blachowicz maintained the superior angle, he had multiple potent weapons, whilst Cannonier might be limited to just one arm in range as a legitimate threat. In the second round, Blachowicz started to utilize strikes to Cannonier's center mass to punish the American's attempts to walk him down, namely body jabs and teeps, which were pretty effective against Cannonier's relatively squared up stance. One of the inverted combinations that I talked about a little before, a right hook followed by a left straight, caught Cannonier unawares and dropped him to the canvas. Cannonier did make some adjustments and came on strong at the end of the fight, winning the third round, but having banked 2 rounds already, Blachowicz was declared the victor. In March 2018, Jan would get the opportunity to avenge one of his prior defeats, rematching dangerous English puncher Jimmy Manawa, famous for one of the most devastating lead left hooks in the history of the light heavyweight division, and fighting him in his hometown of London, no less. Taking advantages of Manawa's instinct to walk his opponents to the fence and club them with a left hook, Blachowicz altered the approach he'd taken with Cannonier, pulling the Englishman onto counters. In doing so, he dropped Manawa in the first round with an unorthodox combination. Utilizing strange combinations throughout the fight, and ensuring that his head was positioned in a place to limit the risk of being countered for certain strikes, such as, a right uppercut that Jan would throw. That's typically considered a very risky punch to throw at the beginning of a combination, but he would ensure that his head is positioned in a place where the threat was limited. Blachowicz's modular striking overloaded Manawa's processing power, basically, keeping him guessing and making him less offensive in focus. Jan would then take the win in a unanimous decision. Jan's next fight against Nikita Krylov in Moscow would be contested largely on the ground and result in a submission win for the Pole, but during the limited action on the feet, Blachowicz did deliver big body kicks in order to punish Krylov's karate-style lunges, which hop along a linear axis. In February 2019, Blachowicz's career would hit another speed bump as he lost a bout against Brazilian brawler Thiago Marreta Santos. Faced with an opponent with an athletic and unpredictable style, Blachowicz fought conservatively but intelligently in the first 2 rounds, chipping away at his legs and body in an attempt to wear away at Santos' explosivity. At the beginning of round 3, however, whether out of patience or seeking to test Santos, Jan stormed towards Marreta with the sole unsuccessful Blacho blitz of his career, pretty much, going down from a hook from Marreta and getting finished on the ground with hammer fists. Blachowicz would get back to his winning ways and finally make a mark on the casual fan radar by welcoming former middleweight champion Luke Rockhold to the light heavyweight division. After a somewhat tense build-up punctuated by constant condescension and rudeness coming from Rockhold, Blachowicz would end up crushing the American. With Rockhold attempting to push Blachowicz to the cage and drag him to the floor, Jan showcased his ability in the clinch, framing off of Rockhold and catching him with short hooks off the break, as well as battering the rangy southpaw's lead leg with low kicks. Rockhold was saved by the bell at the end of round 1 after being dropped by a legendary Polish head kick. As Rockhold once again tried to get the wrestling working against Blachowicz, the Pole hurt Rockhold's leg and finished him off with a big left hook off of the clinch break. Jan would win a split decision in his next fight against former Strikeforce middleweight champion Ronaldo Jacare Souza. Jacare's combination of heavy hands, decent slipping head movements, and world-class grappling ability forced an intelligent, if somewhat conservative, game plan out of Blachowicz. The most consistent weapon used by Jan in this fight were his low kicks, both inside and outside, which would force Souza to switch to southpaw for virtually the entire 5th round. Blachowicz also used the jab and other intercepting weapons such as clinch knees and body kicks to land attritional damage as Souza marched after Blachowicz. It was a pretty tactical fight, quite slow pace, 5-rounder. Frankly, not the most exciting fight in the world, which probably pushed back Blachowicz a little bit further in his quest for title contention, even despite the win. But, he nullified a pretty dangerous opponent in a really smart way. Blachowicz would finally stamp his ticket to a UFC title shot with a win in another rematch against Corey Anderson, another longtime veteran that had jumped into the casual consciousness by knocking out a surging Johnny Walker in the very first round. Anderson, a jack of all trades but master of none with a relatively high work rate, had taken a unanimous decision victory over Blachowicz back in 2015, but he would be unable to replicate this result half a decade later. Jabbing Anderson consistently to the chest to punish his forward movement and discouraging level changes, Blachowicz also sat down on big punches, including a massive right-hand counter to Anderson's outside low kick, which shut the lights out in the first round. In this fight, we also start to see the more consistent application of parrying as Blachowicz's primary means of defending punches. In September 2020, Jan Blachowicz got his shot at the title against the number 1 ranked contender, Dominic Reyes, who was fighting for the title vacated by John Jones, who'd won a highly controversial and widely criticized unanimous decision victory over Reyes in February of that year. Jones left the light heavyweight division instead of giving Reyes a rematch, leaving Jan Blachowicz to duke it out with the Mexican-American contender for the vacant title. Reyes was overwhelmingly seen as a favourite amongst fans, analysts, and odd makers. I mean, after all, how could this guy beat John Jones and then lose to Jan Blachowicz? As it turned out, Reyes was not going to be crowned champion. An active kicking game from Jan targeted the body and both sides of the southpaw Reyes' right leg and showed effect almost immediately. Jan would use classic anti-southpaw boxing combinations, including feinting a right cross to land a left hook, with success. But whereas the majority of offense in the first round was Jan's kicks, the Pole would find increasing success with punching combinations, taking advantage of superior angles and using long combinations to get at Reyes, whose simple but effective single-layer counter punching style was basically overwhelmed by the pressure. After relocating Reyes' nose to the far side of his face, a left straight from the Frazier step and follow-up right would mark the beginning of the end for Reyes. This game plan paid massive dividends, but was a significant departure from Blachowicz's typical fighting style, which shows the Pole's willingness to enter into the fire and trade, so to speak, if it is a calculated risk that he is willing to take, because he has an expectation of success. His inverted combinations, again, had big success against the southpaw opponents. Not the first time, not the last time, but that's definitely something else worth noting from that fight. If, in 2015, you would have said that Jan Blachowicz would be a UFC champion one day, you would have been laughed out of the room. And yet it happened. And despite defying expectations, the Prince of Szczecin would once again be overlooked in his very next fight after he won the title. At UFC 259 in March 2021, Blachowicz would defend his title against then undefeated middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. Having smoked an undefeated challenger in Paulo Costa, Adesanya was at the height of his reputation. A highly versatile, if in hindsight imperfect, kickboxer, Adesanya was being touted as the greatest striker the UFC had ever seen, with some arguing that he was superior to even the legendary Anderson Silva. Adesanya was a betting favourite to prevail over the stronger, but shorter in both height and reach, and slower Blachowicz, and take double champ status in preparation for a showdown with John Jones. The popular narrative going into the fight downplayed Blachowicz's technical ability, characterizing him as a one-punch power striker with limited depth. Despite atrocious commentary from Joe Rogan, especially claiming the contrary, Blachowicz would outstrike Adesanya with a cerebral approach before taking him down in the 4th and 5th rounds to secure the win once the Pole started tiring in the championship rounds. Blachowicz nullified the key long-range element of Adesanya's game, namely his leg kicks. Adesanya had carved a path of destruction throughout the middleweight division with a relatively simple process, damaging his opponent's legs with long low kicks, getting them behind on the scorecards, and then forcing them to desperately lunge at him in an attempt to knock him out. Adesanya would then use the footwork to angle off and land devastating counters. Blachowicz' effective checking game, informed by his experience as a European Muay Thai champion, forced Adesanya to himself begin exchanges where Blachowicz would punish interstitial movements. He also exploited Adesanya's defensive habits, which included leaning away from strikes to the head. This in itself was a system that had been utilized to exploit the headhunting endemic amongst most of the middleweights that Adesanya had faced previously, and was made possible down in that division by Adesanya's significant height advantage over the rest of that division. It wasn't as workable in light heavyweight, where even though Jan Blachowicz was shorter and had a shorter reach than Adesanya, the difference was not as massive as it had been with the middleweights. Jan would use jabs and kicks to the body to force Adesanya back on several occasions, as well as using long left hooks with a Fraser step to catch a leaning Adesanya. But yet MMA is a sport of peaks and troughs. In his very next fight, a title defense against a 42-year-old Glover Teixeira, actually, interestingly enough, the two combatants had a combined age of 80 years old in the cage, Jan suffered the most one-sided loss of his UFC career. While he started to get some good punching combinations off in the second round, mostly based around the uppercut, which is Teixeira's historic Achilles heel, Jan was taken down by the veteran grappler and forced to submit. Forced to defend his #1 contender ranking against a young up-and-comer, Jan faced off in May 2022 against Austrian Serb contender Alexander Rocket Rakic. The very rangy and tall Serb fights from a side-on long stance to emphasize the range on his 1-2, but his tendency to bend his knees into his stance sits his weight on his long legs and makes him vulnerable to low kicks. Pairing consistent low kicks with a specially trained combination of a left hook to the body followed by a right overhand to the head, Blachowicz got the better of a competitive first round. An early check in round 2 got a big reaction from Rakic, who promptly took Blachowicz down and held him there for the rest of the round. In round 3, Blachowicz diversified these attacks off the left body hook and suddenly became the winner by TKO when Rakic's leg gave out. Despite the weird outcome, the Rakic fight does further illuminate the adaptability of Jan Blachowicz. While the left hook to the body and right overhand looks a little janky, it takes Jan's head off of the center line when delivering offense, which is important to limit the potency of Rakic's 1-2. He did enough in round 1 that Rakic would just assume that every left body hook would end up with a right overhand following it, but in round 3 he started throwing different punches as his secondary shot, throwing Rakic off. In December 2022, Blachowicz would get a chance to fight for another vacant light heavyweight title, as Yuri Prochazka, who had defeated Glover Teixeira, relinquished the title whilst treating an injury, leading the UFC to upgrade a 3-round fight between Blachowicz and Magomed Ankalaev to a 5-round title bout, a fact that Blachowicz only became aware of en route to Las Vegas. Whilst of course these circumstances affected Ankalaev too, it is not unreasonable to say that a sudden interest in bout duration is likely to favour significantly the younger fighter, and as the fight turned out, if it had remained a 3-round fight, Blachowicz would have actually clearly won the fight instead of it being a draw. Throughout the bout, Blachowicz would punish the interstitial movement intrinsic to Ankalaev's southpaw kickboxing style, which makes a great deal of use of rapid step-in, straight punching combinations. Both fighters would utilize leg kicks and body kicks as a result of the openings made by the open stance matchup. Blachowicz especially battered Ankalaev's legs to the point where he could barely walk. Blachowicz' tiredness down the stretch though, and Ankalaev's success at securing late takedowns, and quite significant ground and pound in the final round, led to a split draw, with neither fighter crowned the new light heavyweight champion. Rather than run the Ankalaev fight back, an inexplicably irritated Dana White instead announced another vacant title bout between Glover Teixeira and Jamal Hill. Whilst Jan Blachowicz had to take on former middleweight champion and nemesis of Israel Adesanya, Alex Pereira, at altitude in Salt Lake City, Utah, Blachowicz rolled the dice at attempting to get a submission win in the first round, banking that opening stanza but being unable to get the finish. Tired from the grappling, Pereira took over the second round as a result of Blachowicz's inability to really keep the pace up with him. Although Blachowicz did utilize some left hooks and low kicks to decent success. The third round was highly competitive. 2 out of the 3 judges would score that round for Pereira, whilst one of the judges would score it for Blachowicz. Personally, I feel Blachowicz deserved to win this round and therefore the fight. Working off of the left hook with varied right hand punches, connecting on clinch breaks, jabbing to the body, and even successfully catching Pereira with a Blaho blitz, Blachowicz worked himself back into the fight against one of the most feared strikers in MMA history. In my honest opinion, I think that the relative body language. Both fighters were clearly tired fighting at altitude, but the older and more heavily built Blachowicz was more actively puffing and huffing and puffing. And I think that swayed the judge's decision in favor of Pereira, and it probably made some of the strikes that Pereira landed look more damaging than they were, with Blachowicz reacting more to his fatigue than to the actual strikes. On March the 22nd, Blachowicz will be tasked once again with turning away a young up-and-comer, this time Kiwi contender Carlos Ulberg. Ulberg is fast, rangy, and fairly powerful, and whilst he is a legitimate threat for Jan, I do favour the veteran Pole to get the win. It's worth noting that Jan is coming off of major surgeries and hasn't fought since July of 2023 as a result, and at 42 years old, it's absolutely possible that Jan comes in looking old, rusty, uncoordinated, etc., and just gets run over. But if he does look anything like his old self, I believe that he will, despite his underdog status, beat Black Jag. I believe Ulberg has thus far been put up against largely favourable matchups. I wasn't particularly impressed by his last fight against Volkan Oezdemir, and Jan isn't typically anywhere near as positionally aggressive as Oezdemir, who gives plenty of opportunities for Ulberg's fast left hook. I personally can't escape the feeling that Ulberg's a one-trick pony, dependent much more on athleticism than actual skill. But he is undoubtedly a fighter still in development, so we'll see what he looks like here. He may have leveled up in a really noticeable way. We'll have to see. I did notice in Ulberg's fight against Oezdemir lots of opportunities for low kicks that I feel Jan will exploit, and Ulberg's tendency to back up to the fence if pressed can also be taken advantage of by Jan, like he has with many opponents before. Either way, win or lose, in regards of how he looks in his next fight, Jan is a legend, and I hope that everyone that watched this through to the end enjoyed the analysis, and I hope that it taught you a little bit of something and helped you to appreciate more Jan Blachowicz. Whether his next fight is his last, or if it just ends up being the start of yet another title reign, who knows. But either way, he's a great fighter, he's an underrated fighter, and he has some really interesting tips and tricks that any developing martial artist can probably incorporate into their game. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It was a pleasure. I'll see you in the next episode of Dialectic of Violence. See ya.